Committee of Finance, Economic Opportunities and Tourism. Siraj and Tafsir, I just want to quickly check with you. Are we online?
Yes, ma'am, we'll be all good to go.
Okay, and Lizette and Zaida, is the recording on?
Yes, Chair, the recording has started.
Okay. Thank you and welcome to our committee today. My name is Deirdre Bartman. I am chairperson of this committee. And today we have the public hearings on the Western Cape 19th Gambling and Racing Amendment Bill B1 2020. Colleagues and officials and interested stakeholders, I'm just quickly going to go through apologies and some housekeeping. I received an indication, Honorable Makamba Bocha seemed to have declined the meeting invite, but I didn't receive an apology, so I'm assuming that is an apology on her behalf. In terms of video and audio, I would please like to request that everyone mutes themselves and puts their video off unless they are on the floor. So for example, if you're presenting, you're welcome to put your video on, you're welcome to unmute yourself. But if you're not presenting or you're not at the moment asking a question, I would like us to then put our video and audio off. To the members, if you would like to ask a question, or if you would like to raise a point of order, please use the raise the hand function. And you're obviously welcome to put your video and your audio on when you are asking a question or on the floor. Members, just a reminder that we are live on YouTube and the meeting is being recorded. And I'm just going to go through the schedule, and then after that I'm going to ask that the members introduce themselves, and then I'm going to ask the lead person from each organization or department to introduce themselves and their team, and then I will just also ask that our legal advisors in the meeting today just also introduce themselves. But let me just quickly go through the agenda. So firstly, we will have the briefing from the Provincial Treasury on the bill. And we've had a briefing before, so colleagues, please stick to your time limit. Then we will have our oral submissions, firstly from the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board, and then from Tsogo Sun, then Vukani Gambling, then we'll have Sun International, then the National Gambling Board, and then Professor Peter Collins. We will then have a break, and then after the break, there will be opportunity for any additional stakeholders or members of the public to indicate whether they have questions or would like to make a comment, as well as questions and answers. And I will give preference to members of the public today, since the members of the committee will also have opportunity on Friday to continue with questions and answers in the next committee meeting. And then we will complete the meeting with resolutions and further actions. Colleagues, members, I'm going to first allow you to introduce yourselves.
Good morning, Chair. Andrikus van der Westhuizen, member of the committee.
Thank you, Honorable van der Westhuizen.
Goeiemôre, Voorsitter Dylan Mitchell, lid van hierdie staande komitee.
Thank you, Member Mitchell. I'm going to now ask that Provincial Treasury will be your lead person today. If you can just introduce yourselves.
Good morning, Chairperson, and good morning to members. The Provincial Treasury, I'm David Savage, the head of the department. The Provincial Treasury team today will be led by Anthony Phillips. And we're also joined by our Deputy Director General, Dr. Roy Haberman, Dr. Ndodana and Leah, and Ms. Kay Horton.
Thank you so much. Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board, if your lead person could just introduce themselves.
Good morning, Chairperson David Lakay. I am the Chairperson of the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board. Our presentation will be led by Ms. Yvonne Skepu, who is the head legal services at the Gambling Board, and also in attendance is a board member, Mr. Claude Bashade. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much. So Hassan, are you in the meeting yet? Miss Brandt or Advocate Pillay or Mr. De Lange? Hi. Miss Advocate Pillay, oh, there we go, unmuted.
Thank you. Apologies for that. Good morning, Chairperson and members of the committee. My name is Carisha Pillay. I'm an advocate at the Cape Bar, and I'm here this morning on behalf of Vukani and Sugusan. I'm being instructed by ENS, Miss Esty Brandt from ENS, and Jan De Lange from Sugusan is present as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So that's Vukani Sun as well. Sun International, are they in the meeting yet? Mr. Altini or Miss Engelbrach or Miss Thomas or Mr. Reddy? Hi.
Good morning, Chair. It's Nick Altini speaking from Herbert Smith Freehills on behalf of Sun International. I'm joined by my colleague Liana Engelbrach, and there are representatives of Sun International with us as well, Ms. Annabelle Thomas and Mr. Lenny Reddy.
Thank you so much. National Gambling Board, are you in the meeting yet? Ms.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to see. Oh, Ms. Funga, there we go.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chairperson, for this opportunity to attend. My name is Caroline Kongwa, the Administrator for the National Gambling Board, and then I'm joined by my colleagues. My colleague who will be leading our presentation is Ms. Sibahle Nwata. She's our legal advisor. And then I have Mr. Shelton Pagiwa, who's our Senior Manager Gaming Technology, and Ms. Yvonne Gwenhure, who's our Economic Researcher. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Peter Collins, are you on our meeting today? I think I saw your name earlier.
I am here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you, Professor Collins. And you'll be making an individual submission.
I'm making an individual submission with someone with no vested interest, but a great deal of interest over a long period in gambling and public policy.
No problem. Thank you, Professor Peter Collins. Okay, those are all the persons and institutions who have requested to do oral submissions today. Provincial Treasury, you can jump right in and I will give you an extra 3 minutes, which I will take off the committee's break since I went into that. Just before that, can our legal advisor just quickly introduce themselves?
Chair Romeo Master, good morning, as legal advisor for the Western Cape Provincial Parliament.
Thank you so much. Okay, Mr. Phillips, I'm going to put my video off. Oh, hi, Ms. Miller.
Good morning, Chair. My name is Astrid Miller, and I'm State Law Advisor from Legal Services at the Department of the Premier, Western Cape Government.
Thank you for being here today. Okay. Mr. Phillips, you're welcome to jump right into your presentation. I am going to put my video off for connectivity reasons, but I will put it on should I need to be on the floor. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chairperson. Is somebody going to share it from that side, the presentation? Or should I do it?
You can go ahead, Mr. Phillips.
Okay, thank you. Sure. Can everybody see the presentation?
Not yet, but let's give it a few minutes or a few seconds just so that perhaps it's still loading.
Just redo it quickly. I think it's shown now.
Yes, it is shown now. Okay. If you could perhaps just put it, oh, there we go, in presentation mode. Thank you, Mr. Phillips.
Thanks, Chairperson. Good morning, Chairperson, members, honorable members, and guests actually to this public hearing. My name is Anthony Phillips, and I will be taking you through the presentation, but I thought of actually just prefacing the presentation based on a context, both from an economic perspective, but also from a fiscal perspective and its implications. and then I'll jump into the order of the day to start off with. I will actually tackle the shortfall as well as the 19th Amendment through the presentation. Chairperson, maybe just to start here and just maybe some reality check in terms of where we find ourselves as a country and the difficult choices that rest within the public policy environment with regard to where this country finds itself. So just to give you just a brief update with regard to the economy, and highlighting basically in 2020 after Q2 between April and June 2020, our economy, the South African economy, has contracted quarter by quarter or seasonally adjusted by 51%, or if one actually just put that into annual terms, it's about 16.4% contraction in the South African economy year-on-year comparison. Both from a tax collection perspective, we're seeing our tax revenue has been contracted roughly about 20% up to this year-on-year, with excise down by 70%, VAT down by 22%, and within the first 4 months of the 2021-22 financial year, the National Treasury has already borrowed up to 260 billion. So based on that, and I've just tried to highlight this particular schematic on the slide that highlights that this gives us a picture of our debt to GDP ratio. But it shows that between 2021, we have to make some decision with regard, government has to make some decision with regard to where we find itself and where and the trajectory moving forward. I'm just trying to get rid of something that's flashing on the screen here, ma'am. Sorry for that. Okay, so it means that within this particular picture, we're seeing that if you look at just the blue line, that our debt to GDP at some stage will exceed the revenue that we collect as a government if we do not do anything going forward from a policy perspective or economic policy perspective. This slide also highlights that 2021 basically is where we have to make hard decisions, and the national government has made the hard decision, highlighting that something has to be done if we want to save the economy of this country basically, and also make sure that we put our country on a fiscally sustainable path as such. In this regard, we're saying looking at this, the National Treasury highlighted that as of next year that there would be a 230 billion cut with regard to government expenditure. And if I have to bring it just closer to home, it has implications for the Western Cape, and it means that the Western Cape budget will have to be reduced by 5 billion per annum, or as we're saying about 7% of what we spend this year on a response to COVID, or even 25% of a health or education budget needs to be cut to ensure that we accommodate the national fiscus reduction as cut as well. So everything that flows from this is a response to the unsustainable economic environment, the need from a social perspective that we need to address, and then obviously the hard priorities on a government perspective to be tackled moving forward. So therefore, basically, the point was looking at just the gambling board, one of the public entities reporting within to the provincial government, provincial treasury, or the finance department in perspective, highlighting that in 1997 the provincial policy determinations was dealing with licensed gambling, and the whole idea was to make the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board also self-sustainable by prescribing certain collections of fees basically that would accrue to the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board that will make them almost sustainable and not dependent on government transfers. In this regard, we've also seen that the new and annual license fees, investigation fees, and deposits would accrue to the board. However, since the expiration of exclusivity as well as the expiration of the limited machine operator fees, the board had to really become more reliant on government transfers in that regard. However, given the spending cuts imposed by national government moving forward, the priorities that government is facing, it becomes very much more important that we have a self-sustainable board going forward. Chairperson, just and colleague and members basically and guests actually just highlighting here, and I think this particular slide it's quite fairly insightful. Highlighting actually what happened actually with regard to exclusivity fees, which is the blue bars there, actually showing actually that in 2015 it came to an end as being one of the sources of funding the board, as well as the operator fees, basically LPM operator fees actually in 2017. The yellow bar right on top actually highlights actually how government transfers actually have been increasing to make the board self-sustainable moving forward. So in this case, actually it says, look, there's been a decline in revenues actually to the board actually based on the expiration of exclusivity and moving forward. However, from the government perspective, actually it's more the increase in transfers in that regard. Chairperson, this on this slide. The slide just highlights basically a high-level comparison, basically in terms of the expenditure per board, actually, and maybe just comparison between Eastern Cape, Gauteng, KwaZulu, and the Western Cape. Noting actually the government transfers and the percentage transfers actually the government make actually towards the board. In the case actually of the Western Cape, it was 46%. And then obviously just the last one actually just highlights basically the percentage transfers actually where am I now on the presentation. I probably seem to have lost the presentation, but you can see it from where you are. Chairperson, I'm off the presentation now.
Mr. Phillips, let's
Yes,
try to quickly just give you a minute or two to put it back on. Alternatively, Ms. Adams can perhaps assist you.
Sure. I don't know if it shows there.
Yes, I can see it. Thank you.
So it shows basically at 9% actually that the Western Cape board as a percentage of taxes at 9.1% actually compared to all of the others actually, which is relatively high percentages with regard to that. So the principle around is actually to have a board actually that is independent, that is actually funded through the industry, that it actually is adequately funded actually to perform its mandate, as well as to make sure that that we have a regulator that actually can impose the right fee and avoid, in this case, being underfunded. In the case of the Western Cape government, we have adopted the principle actually that the industry will pay for its regulation. And I think this is actually in line with international best practice, basically, as is passed within the UK and in the Australian example cited below. Chairperson, this slide here just highlights basically what we're looking at, the growth in LPM and casino AGRs, basically, and in this case, highlighting actually that the proposed amendment fees, actually regulated fees in cost regulations, are that we are looking at 1.3 of AGRs for the casinos, while at the LPMs actually at 1.5 and 1.9, basically in that regard. Coming back to what the order of the day basically is actually looking at, I think the first few slides actually just highlighted the context in which we find ourselves basically, and then obviously the rationale for looking at the 19th. So we're saying, look, we're looking at the 19th actually, and provides for the introduction of a casino operator fee. I'm just breaking the two elements down. The fee is calculated basically on the exclusivity, but it actually has been brought forward to the present value. And then obviously we're highlighting actually that around the original investment into the development actually, and we've used the 175 million actually, and the 175 million that exceeded 175 in this case. So it's 2.8 per annum, escalating at an annual fee as the cost of state-based debts to the state, as determined by the Minister of Finance from time to time. And then obviously any development actually above 175 million, actually the accrued amount actually would be then 18.37 million basically from the casino operator fees. Actually, that's the anticipated. With regard to the LPMs, and I think based on actually the increments of 500, 1,000, and 1.5, actually it actually puts the limits of 1.9, 3.9, and 5.8, and basically based on last year's actually collection, actually we're saying actually that we are looking at approximately funding actually of 3.34 million actually from this particular source to offset expenditure. Progress to date. We say it's not appropriate to compare fees across the provinces. as the gambling legislation differs. The funding models difference, the cost of gambling boards differ, and the size of the industry differ actually, and the forms of gambling rollout actually also differ. Okay, so we're saying actually that looking at the entire South African gambling law actually effectively creates fiscal monopolies with the implicit aim of furthering social goals. The province has adopted a progressive tax system and fee system in order to afford new entrants into the market and smaller operators fees. Basically, the formula used soaks the bigger players, casinos and LPA operators. A progressive tax system reduces the burden on the marginal industries and new entrants. And the progress today, Chairperson, actually, we're saying, look, the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board actually seeks to support the move to financial self-sufficiency of the board by levying certain statutory fees. We are reintroducing the limited gaming operator fee, introducing a casino operator fee, and providing certain fees to be payable to the board. That's the objective of the board. Progress today actually was tabled in the legislation on February 28th. Pursuant to this, the provincial instructed only those matters relating to the self-sufficiency of the board, actually. Okay, and we've actually made accommodation for the casino relocation and other matters incidental to that in the 20th and the 21st amendment bills. So we are only looking actually now at the 19th, which looks at the previous 3 points, actually, Chairperson. Based on the recommendation, we say the provincial recommends the Standing Committee facilitate the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is aimed to promote the self-sufficiency of the board. The other matters actually relates to the exclusivity, and it's not actually dealt with in the 19th ever. That's where we are, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. And you actually ended with 3 minutes to spare, which I appreciate. Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board. We could. Mr. Lekay, do you have a presentation for us?
Chairperson, Ms. Skepu will be leading the presentation, and the presentation was forwarded to the Scofiat.
Will you be putting a presentation up, or will you be speaking, doing your presentation oral form?
Skepu will take over from here, Chairperson. She will be doing the presentation.
No problem. Mr. Phillips, if you could then maybe just unshare your presentation for us quickly, please. Thank you.
There we are, ma'am.
Ms. Skepu?
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, members of the committee and the National Gambling Board and the industry representatives attending the public hearing this morning. Chair, the board wishes to thank the committee for the opportunity to make oral submissions pertaining the proposed or draft 19th Gambling and Racing Amendment Bill. Chair, we have submitted the board's presentation, and I do not know if Ms. Adams is able to just flight the slides for the attendees to see the presentation.
Okay, Ms. Adams, if you could perhaps just put up the Gambling and Racing Board's presentation for us, please. Or Ms. Kluter.
Ms. Kluter will be flighting the presentation shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I will then just proceed with an outline of the submissions. It's the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board's presentation.
Ms. Kluter?
The National Gambling Board.
It's the one that starts with the Western Cape emblem, and then it says Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board presentation at public hearing. Ms. Kluter?
Okay, I'll change it now, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I will just, by way of introduction, continue in the interim. Chair, the committee received a detailed outline of the nature of the amendments that is proposed. In the main, it introduces a casino operator fee. It provides for the board, for certain fees to accrue to the board, the license fees.
Ms. Skipper, for interrupting you. I don't see the presentation yet, so I'm just going to ask quickly that we just get the presentation up, because there are also other stakeholders who haven't necessarily got the presentation and would like to see it while you are presenting. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Ms. Skipper, you may continue.
Thank you, Chairperson. Yeah, just by way of introduction, Chair, the 19th Gambling Amendment Bill provides for certain license fees payable by licensees to be paid to the board, which hitherto has been paid into the Provincial Revenue Fund. It also provides for a new casino operator fee to be paid by the holders of casino operator licenses. It also affects certain amendments to the limited gambling machine operator fees that is payable to the board. And there is a table that specifies the fees payable by the casino operators. Chair, the department took the committee through the rationale for the amendments. Suffice to state from the board side that it is of the view that its independence and self-sufficiency is interrelated, and that if these amendments were to be adopted, then the board would essentially be self-sufficient. And this also aligns with the objectives specified in the 1999 policy determinations for the board to become self-sufficient as soon as possible. The board has previously submitted comments on these amendments since the first publication of the bill in 2018, just in terms of the historical background, Chair. Chair, and then the next slide just breaks down the provisions that was included in the 2018 version of the bill that was published for comment. And but essentially, as indicated, the bill just deals with these three categories of fees as outlined under the introduction. Chair, the board makes, so we've now stated the board's gratitude and satisfaction with it, with a vehicle now having been set, or a modus having been set for the board to become self-sufficient. And the industry will, of course, also comment in terms of the impact of the proposed amendments on their operations. But the board supports the principle that it ought to be self-sufficient in terms of regulating the industry, and also to accord proper independence to the board. Chair, then the board took the opportunity to also propose certain amendments to address the quorum issue on the board. And essentially, the issue is that the board had in the past operated for quite an extensive period of time with just 5 members having been appointed to the board. That then meant that no member could have an emergency or be excused from attendance of a meeting else the board would be without a quorum and the meeting could not proceed. In the past, the chairperson had to change meeting dates or had to make recommendations for decision by the board via round-robin processes. And the board is of the view that 2 amendments can be considered to the Act to address this issue going forward, Chair. And the first proposal is that an amendment be effected to Section 6 of the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Act, Chair, which reads that a member of the board shall hold office for such period not exceeding 4 years as the Executive Council may determine at the time of his or her appointment to the board. And a member of the board shall be eligible for reappointment at the termination of his or her term of office. Subsection 2, the Executive Council may extend the term of office of a member of the board for a period not exceeding 1 year. Chair, having looked at the specialized nature of the industry, and practice has taught us that it takes a board member roughly between 1 and 2 years to get acquainted with the landscape and the legislative scheme that regulates the gambling industry. So essentially, the substance of a member's contribution on the board, the industry start enjoying that benefit, and the board, in terms of its decision making and its deliberations, will enjoy the benefit of that member's substantive inputs for the latter part of a member's term. Chair, so the board is recommending that, as opposed to a member's term being extended for a period of 1 year only, that provision be amended to read that the Executive Council may extend the term of office of a member of the board for a period not exceeding 3 years. So this would then leave the Executive Council room to continue with vetting and appointment processes, and where it appears that there are time delays or other unforeseen circumstances, that a board member's term can be extended for a period of up to 3 years, Chair. That also means that the period of reappointment can be either 1 or 2 or 3 years. Chair, then, coupled with this, the board also wish to make a second proposal for amendment to the Act, and that is to look at the quorum provision couched in Section 18 of the Act. Section 18, subsection 3 reads that the quorum for a meeting of the board shall be 5 members. Chair, and we've done some research, and we looked at the quorum provisions of the other provincial legislation, as well as that of the National Gambling Act. And the majority of the legislation indicates that a quorum will be a majority of the members appointed from time to time. I think it applies across the board, bar one board, I think it is Limpopo, that indicates that a quorum will be 5 members of the board, but the composition of the board is that it consists of 9 members. So technically that would also refer to a simple majority of the members that were appointed. So Chair, the proposal there is that the amendment to Section 18.3 could read, the quorum for a meeting of the board shall be a majority of the members appointed from time to time. Yes, as indicated, Chair, that would go at great length to avoid the quorum issues that from time to time face the board, especially whilst the vetting and appointment processes is still underway. We often find that new members are appointed either in the same month that a member's term is expiring, or it often goes beyond that, and the board is then left with a minimal number of board members appointed. So those are then the two recommendations from the board chair, and for the committee's consideration to look at whether or not this could be taken forward in the final version, or then in subsequent deliberations on amendments to the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Act, Chair. That is our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Skepu, and you actually stayed exactly on 10 minutes. Okay, the next submission is from Tsogo-san, but Advocate Pillay, I wanted to find out, are you going to do Tsogo-san and Vukani's submissions at the same time, or would you like to do them separately?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. There is a considerable degree of overlap, as members would have noted, between both the submissions, but at the request of the clients, my request to you is going to be that I make separate submissions and separately take up the 10-minute slot for each Tsogo and Vukani, if that would be in order.
That is in order, since there are two separate clients. It's 9:37. You will then have 10 minutes until 9:47, and then again until 9:57. I'm thus not going to interrupt you then between the two. You can then indicate to us when you're switching over. Members, there's no presentation that will be put up, but you have received the matrix of all of the comments from different people, including departmental comments and legal comments. Please use that to also follow the presenter. Advocate Pillay, you may continue.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. So if I could perhaps start by expressing gratitude on behalf of both Tsogo-san and Vukani for the opportunity to engage with the committee in relation to this bill. And I think we value, I can say with little hesitation, that we value this opportunity, and we hope that it will ultimately result in a more efficient and workable piece of legislation that will nevertheless serve to achieve the objectives as have been stated. As regards the structure of the presentation, Chairperson and members of the committee, there really are three headline points that I'd want to canvass in the course of presenting to you. The first is to address the question of the legal threshold against which this bill will ultimately fall to be viewed. The second is to go very quickly through the key objectives of the bill. And the third is to raise the objections in relation to the bill. And if I could then perhaps start with the first of the three, and that is the legal principles. Principle number one that I'd want to highlight to the committee is, of course, we know that as a matter of constitutional principle, it lies in the discretion of government as to the matters that it chooses to legislate on. And it's not for the public or any other entity to be prescribing to government as to what it can in fact legislate on. The only limitation or perhaps qualifier to it is provided the subject matter falls within the competency of the government sphere that's legislating on it, it would be in order to go ahead. So that's the first perhaps legal principle I'd want to highlight. The second is the well-established constitutional principle that when government chooses to legislate on an issue, it must ensure that its legislation meets the threshold of rationality. And you members, you will all be well appraised that the principle of rationality is something that is foundational to the South African constitutional framework. And what it really means is that laws must be sourced in legal prescript, and it also means that the government may not act capriciously or arbitrarily in achieving the objectives it seeks to achieve. It further means that government must seek to vindicate legitimate government purposes in its legislative framework. And I think most importantly, in terms of informing the lens through which this bill falls to be looked at, one must ensure that there's a rational nexus between the legislative scheme as set out and the pursuit of the legitimate government objective. And if I could pause there perhaps for a moment and just elicit what I mean by that. And what I mean is that in this instance, the central objective of the bill is to ensure that the board is able to be financially independent. And the question then would be whether the means that the bill adopts in order to vindicate that central objective meets the threshold of rationality in this instance. The next important point on the law relating to rationality, members, is that you would be aware that the inquiry isn't about how it impacts on a particular industry player, but it's overall on an objective inquiry whether or not the law objectively considered passes this threshold of rationality. And so the first substantive standard against which this law will be looked at is, does it meet the threshold of rationality? The second substantive standard against which it falls to be looked at is whether or not it results in an infringement, an impermissible infringement of any of the constitutional rights at issue. Members of the committee, you will be aware that at the heart of amendments of this kind lie the constitutional right protected by Section 22 of the Constitution. And that right makes provision for the right to freedom of choice in relation to trades, occupations, and professions, and it does allow for laws that regulate those rights. And the constitutional law on this right is fairly well established, I would say, and it really means that on the first level, when government adopts legislation, it must ensure that the legislation doesn't constitute a legal barrier to persons seeking to exercise these rights. I'd submit that that doesn't manifest in the present instance in the context of the bill for perhaps for a host of reasons, and I needn't go into that. But the second leg of what this right means is that once one has chosen to exercise one's trade through, for instance, the gambling industry and the measures that are put in place through the legislative framework, it's important that government does not pass laws that make it so onerous or so burdensome in relation to the practice of that trade that the consequence is that it impermissibly limits how one goes about it. And that's a substantive threshold, and the question, members, that you will be interrogating and engaging with this bill is therefore twofold. One, can it be said to be rational when viewed against its objective and the means it chooses to meet that objective? And secondly, does it place an impermissibly high burden in relation to present casino operators and present limited gambling machine operators by virtue of the measures that it adopts? So that's the first of the three issues that I propose canvassing, in other words, the legal threshold. Members, the second is the question of just the overall framework of the bill. I'm not going to belabor that issue because it's already been addressed by presenters who went before me. But I think perhaps just 3 points as we read it, 3 core objectives. The first is to ensure that certain fees are paid to the board instead of the Provincial Revenue Fund. The second is to provide for casino operator fees. And if I could stop there and ask members perhaps just to look at the bill as it stands, and if you wouldn't mind having regard to the amendment in relation to the operator fees. And you'll note that the operator fees are now imposed in relation to the original value of the casino development, and the 2 thresholds that fall to be met in respect of that. And the last aspect of it is in relation to the limited gambling machine operator fees. And if I could perhaps draw your attention to what's provided there, and you'll note that there's, of course, the different thresholds as it previously existed, but you will note that the fee that is now intended to be imposed is substantially higher than what it was previously. Members, you will note, for instance, on a rough calculation, that it's roughly in the range of some 4 times what it previously was. And the question that you will ask yourself is, when you look at those provisions as against the memorandum on the objects of the bill, you will ask yourself, it's the fundamental objective, if I could perhaps refer to clause 1.2 of the objects, is that it's important that the costs of the board are defrayed, that it is financially self-sufficient, and that the industry pays for its own regulation. And members, you'll be aware that that terminology of reference to the industry paying for it is apparent from a further 3 or 4 provisions within the memorandum on the objects of the bill. And the question at the heart of this would be whether the 2 fees, the casino operator fees and the limited gambling machine operator fees, ultimately do result in that objective of the industry paying for its regulation, or whether on a proper construction, the effect of it is really to saddle particular groups or categories, in other words, those who are casino operators and those who hold limited gambling machine operators, with the bulk of the fees disproportionately in respect of that objective. Chairperson, by my calculations, I'm close onto 8 minutes onto the first presentation, and I make those submissions that I have in relation to the general threshold. I now go through the objections to the bill in its current form, and I do so both in respect of Sogol and Vukani. And I think I can summarize the objections as really coming out as to...
Advocate Pillay, apologies for interrupting you. I see a hand. Mr. Lakay, do you have a point of order? Mr. Lakay, I see a hand. Yes.
My apologies, Chair. I just wanted to apologize. I have to unfortunately leave the meeting because I have another board scheduled meeting to attend. Very interesting. I'm so sorry to leave, and I apologize to Advocate for making a wonderful presentation. If I could have, I would stay with you until the very last. So thank you, Chairperson, for this opportunity, and I wish the public hearing all the best as it proceeds. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Lakay. I did receive your apology previously that you'll be leaving early. Advocate Pillay, you may continue. I'm going to add an extra minute to your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm now moving on to the second slot of 10 minutes, Chairperson, and I do so with reference to the grounds of objection. And I locate those very firmly against the legal thresholds that I've already identified. And the first ground of objection is if the imperative is to ensure that the board is self-sufficient at the end of the day, and that it is the industry that pays for the regulation, we would submit that the effect of the bill right now is not that the entire industry pays for it, but it is to disproportionately load the two route operators, being Vukani and Sogo, in relation to it, and to disproportionately load the casino operators. And the effect of that, I would submit, is that there are two categories within the industry who are being ultimately held to meet the objective of making the board self-sufficient. And that's the first point in relation to the objections. The second is the question of how these amounts have been calculated. And one accepts that we're in a time of economic hardship and challenge, both for government, but also for those trading in the industry. And with that in mind, when one looks at the substantial fees as provided for in the bill and the fourfold increase in relation to the limited gambling machine operator fees, and the fact that the casino operator fees are based on the original value of the casino, that's irrespective of what the trading is, what the profits are, etc. We say, particularly in the current context, those are impermissibly excessive, would be the submission. Chairperson, the third difficulty with the bill as it stands is that the submission is that it straddles an important constitutional imperative and principle, and that is around ensuring self-sufficiency and independence of the board. And the one inherent value in the bill as it stands is that it facilitates independence through financial self-sufficiency. And that's a laudable objective. We don't take issue with it. But the danger to it is that it does so through the mechanism of these two avenues, the casino operators and the route operators, effectively. And we say that with the best objective in the world and the best commitment of the board in terms of ensuring its independence, the stark and perhaps perverse outcome may be that a provision like this could in fact have the consequence of impeding that independence. And perhaps if I could give this example to demonstrate the point, and that is if one is, for instance, looking at the question of transgressions and potentially revoking a license. It's no longer a question of, well, has the threshold been met or hasn't it on objective grounds, and do we then revoke as a consequence of that? It is that the consequence of revoking results in an undermining of this particular revenue stream. And for that reason, we say that it may well have the perverse consequence of impeding or limiting the independence of the the board. And I don't want to be heard to be suggesting that this would be an inevitable consequence. Rather, the point is a far more nuanced one. And the nuance is this, Chairperson. It is that it has the potential to do so. And when you have a legislative provision that has the potential to undermine a founding value of independence of the board, one needs to look harshly and strongly at whether or not it's justified in those circumstances. And then the last substantive ground of objection, Chairperson, is the question of the timing of this. Just as government is faces a financial predicament of unprecedented times, so too are those in the industry. I needn't belabor the point. I think members of the committee will be well apprised of what the impact of COVID and the current circumstances have had on the industry. And for that reason, we say it's a particularly inopportune time to be imposing something like this on these scales at this stage. Chairperson, concluding on this point, there've been two different proposals that have been made, one by Sogo Sun and one by Vukani. Those proposals are aimed at recognizing the harsh balancing act that the provincial government's going to have to undertake on this. And you'll be aware, insofar as the Sogo Sun proposal goes, if I could perhaps draw your attention to paragraph 32 of the submission. And the proposal is that the legislature assists in rebuilding the industry by temporarily insulating the industry from new forms of gambling, in particular bingo licenses for, say, the next 5 years. And in return or in exchange, the proposal is that there'd be a casino legislated fee that's in proportion. The proposal is at 0.5% of gross gaming revenue per annum for the next 5 years. And look, the intricacies of whether that ultimately meets the objective or not can be debated, but at the broad level of principle, I think there are two principles that underline it. The first is to ensure that the industry is given an opportunity to recover from what it's been dealing with. And the second is to link it to GGR going forward on it. So that's the proposal made by Sogo in relation to the alternative. Members of the committee, can I then draw your attention to paragraph 16 of the Vukani proposal and take you through, perhaps Vukani says there that it acknowledges that the revenue raising efforts of the provincial legislature, it accepts that certain measures are necessary, and also at the core of its proposal is an opportunity for the industry to be allowed to rebuild itself, as opposed to imposing a measure in these times that has the potential, according to Vukani, to destabilize the industry to the brink of possible ruin. And I would submit that these words need to be taken seriously and we need to tread cautiously on it. And in light of that, Vukani says, in the spirit of a joint effort to rebuild the industry after the state of disaster, the proposal is that the route operator fees are increased as proposed in terms of the Amendment Act, and that the legislature and the board assist the route operator industry to rebuild itself. And certain proposals are made there. The first is not to issue new gaming licenses for a period of, say, 3 years. And the second is in relation to the rollout of Type B licenses. Members of the committee, Chairperson, I think that covers the submissions, both in relation to Sogo and Vukani. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have addressed you on it.
Thank you, Advocate Pillay, and you've stayed exactly to ending on 9:58, and I applaud you for that. Our next, thank you. Our next stakeholder, Sun International, Mr. Altini and Ms. Engelbrecht, will you be leading the presentation for us?
Thank you, Chair. I will be, and we're going to put up our slides, if we may, on the screen.
No problem, you may share it.
Thank you. We have shared it. If you could perhaps just confirm, Chair, when you can see our screen.
Okay, let's give it a second or so. I can see the presentation. It is 9:59 at the moment, and you will then have 10 minutes until 9 minutes past 10. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you again for the opportunity. Comments can be categorized under 4 topics. Firstly, the operating fee needs to fund the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board. Secondly, we look at the appropriateness, reasonableness, and rationality of the proposed operating fees. Thirdly, we think we can't have this discussion without considering the cumulative effects of the proposed fees and other proposed amendments to the gambling legislative regime in the Western Cape province under consideration at the moment. And lastly, we also want to give a word or two on the impact of COVID-19 and the associated national state disaster and lockdown regulations as and we say there's an inherent problem in requiring only two categories of gaming licensee in the province to carry the burden of funding the board. There's no apparent reason to burden LP and route casino operators with this cost when, for example, there are many other bookmakers in the province, and yet there is no mention of them being required to fund shortfalls in the board's operating expenditure. We also say that it's not true that it is an established principle that an industry should or must fund its regulation in totality, and there are many examples where industry participants in regulated sectors do not fund their regulators other than through licensing fees, which of course casinos and route operators also pay, and a good example may be liquor retailers or merchants. And to the next point, which is simply that casino operators and LPM route operators already fund the operations of the board through the payments of annual license and investigation fees, which we'll mention a few times. And the of the casino operator fee and the increase in the LPM operator fee will effectively constitute a double levy to be paid business, while other licensed operators are not required to fund the operations of the board in the same way. The board and provincial government, with great respect, have not illustrated the following, which we say are the minimum needed to even bring a semblance of rationality or justification to the proposed fees. Firstly, why such substantial additional fees are required to fund the operations of the board over and above the licensing fees and investigation costs already paid to the board to fund its operations. Secondly, that the increased operating expenditure incurred by the board will and must continue and cannot be contained while the board's costs exceed the annual increases in licensing fees and investigation fees, which were suitable for a period of time and have increased at an average of 5% over the years. Why now do the board's costs exceed those increases in its revenue over time? Thirdly, the specific shortfall in the funding of the operations of the board and what the cause of that shortfall is, whether or not it relates directly to the operations of the board insofar as they pertain to casinos and LPM operators, since they are targeted to make up the shortfall in operating expenditure. Fifthly, there is no explanation given as to whether the provincial government can or can't allocate additional funds to the board. Considerable gambling taxes generated by gaming in the casino, and in the province, and particularly casinos in this respect. And lastly, whether the board and provincial governments have conducted any proper assessment of actual costs, fees, and taxes paid by operators and the cumulative impact of the various additional fees and taxes now proposed through various different pieces of legislation. So in the absence of a clear and substantiated objective articulating the funding needs of the board in line with the criteria I've just listed, the proposed amendment is with respect irrational. And so the fees that are sought to be extracted from casino are the following points to make in our submissions. Firstly, the fee is proposed to be established, and not with reference to its current revenues, profits, or performance, and that suggests a high degree of arbitrariness in the determination of the fee. Sun International general fees via this casino operator fee alone, and that doesn't take into account there is no clear explanation of what economic opportunity is being paid for through the introduction. And here I refer for the first time to the fact that in another context, the provincial government has fees intended to offset an economic opportunity that is created for casino operators. That mentioned in the memorandum that accompanies the bill at all. The proposed operator fee appears to be linked to exclusivity and the economic opportunity that is alleged to arise from this in circumstances where this new regime of revised exclusivity for casinos in the province, together with concomitant taxes, costs, and fees is already proposed in the 20th and 21st Amendment, why then is the 19th Amendment Bill necessary at all? Taxes, casino license, say the provincial government and the board for the loss of the exclusivity fees. This is in circumstances where the regime of various levies charged to casinos in the Western Cape is already substantially higher than elsewhere in South Africa and even many in the world. And I wish to note at this point that I respectfully disagree with the gentleman who made the first presentation. It is absolutely stands out as an extraordinarily high cost jurisdiction, if I can put it that way. The reported insofar as casinos are concerned, it's not linked to an economic benefit arising. At best, there is a neutral regulatory position that comes from the revisions proposed for casino operating and location in the province, and likely a substantial negative effect on Grand West, which I will come back to in a minute. But first, I want to deal very quickly with the rationality of the proposed LPs. These amendments propose an almost fourfold increase in each category of LPM operator fee. As operator fees already charged are sufficient to defray the cost of the board, as insofar as they operators. Any ostensible shortfall in the board's income related to the operations of LPM route operators is simply dwarfed by the proposed increase in fees, and the board will extract approximately 9.7 million from the two largest LPM route operators under this new proposed fee, in circumstances where its stated shortfall, which apparently is what gives rise to and supports the need for this bill. I said I'd return to make a few comments on being considered together with the 20th and 21st Amendment Bill. The introduction of the proposed casino operator fee and the increase in the LPM operator fee cannot be viewed in isolation of the other bills that are under consideration. Especially the justification to explain why the additional funding is required by the board. The only rational conclusion is that the fees proposed in the 19th bill are aimed at compensating the provincial governments and the board for loss of exclusivity fees. This to be the case based on earlier presentations in the session 2. In any event, the amendments proposed in the 20th bill allow for the relocation of a casino to the Cape Town Metropole, a catchment area previously exclusively held by Grand West Casino. The new regime reduces Grand West Casino's exclusive area by almost 2/3, effectively actually removing any exclusivity for Grand West at all, because there is considerable overlap in the catchment areas of Grand West and the proposed site of the new casino if relocation takes place. The fees and taxes proposed in the 21st Amendment Bill serve as payment of requiring the payment of the casino operator fee under the 19th. As already mentioned, the proposed fees will mean that Sun International pays approximately 10 million rand a year in additional fees for its casino operations and will pay LPM operator fees almost fourfold that of existing fees. But this in circumstances where these fees are not linked to the actual performance of these businesses, but rather based on the size of the operations without any consideration of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on casinos and LPM operators, which I'm going to come to in conclusion in just a minute. With the introduction of the proposed legislative changes under the 20th and 21st Amendment Bill, it's very important to note the following in the context of the 19th Amendment Bill. Firstly, if the 20th and 21st bills are passed in current form, there will be no substantial increases in either provincial gross gambling revenue or tax revenue. Secondly, Grand West will experience a considerable decline in its gross gaming revenue, projected to be between 12.5% and 17%, and that translates into an overall decrease in its net profit of 18 to 24.5%, and with the imposition of the proposed exclusivity tax, Grand West profitability will decline massively by between 24.6 and 30.7%. Grand West loses exclusivity, it gets nothing in return. This approach is unsustainable and will substantially harm the operations of Sun International in the Western Cape. It is with respect unfair, irrational, and unreasonable for the government to implement a complex and unduly burdensome regime. This is the cumulative regime that is under consideration, which is only aimed at achieving outcomes that the government has already achieved through previous amendments to existing legislative regimes. Notably, there has been a continued
Mr.
increase in
Altini,
license
I'm going to
fees.
give you a minute to wrap up your presentation, please.
Thank you. Since 2013 to compensate the government for the loss of exclusivity. Very finally, then, in conclusion, I just wish to make a quick point on the impact of COVID-19 on the gaming industry. As everyone is well aware, it's not business as usual for casinos have only been permitted to operate from 17 June 2020 and then on a curfew basis. LPM online recently because restaurants and bars were closed until effectively 18 August, which is where one most often finds LPM machines in terms of sites. This has been financially devastating to Sun International. Its future is by no means certain. There has been a recent announcement, in fact this week, of Sun International, despite making every effort not to, having to shed some 2,300 jobs, adding additional millions of rands unnecessarily to its financial burden is going to have but one consequence, and that is to possibly push its businesses in the Western Cape over a financial edge. Thank you, Chair, for bearing with me. Those are our submissions. And Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Altini. We now have the National Gambling Board, Ms. Kongwa.
Thank you, Honorable Chairperson. Good morning once again. Good morning to the honorable members, as well as the industry representatives, as well as the members of the public. As indicated before, my name is Sibahle Nwata, the legal advisor of the National Gambling Board, and I will be presenting on behalf of the National Gambling Board. Just a minute to fly to...
sorry.
Just a minute.
I'm going to give you until 22 minutes past 10 to do your presentation. Okay, I can see the presentation. You can just put it in presentation mode for us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you once again, Honorable Chairperson. The purpose of our presentation today is to make our oral submissions to the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Opportunities in Tourism. We are making our representation on the Western Cape 19th Gambling and Racing Amendment Bill, B1 2020. Just a brief background on the National Gambling Board, as well as the legislative framework within the gambling industry. The National Gambling Board is a statutory body established in terms of the National Gambling Act, that is to provide for the coordination of concurrent national and provincial legislative competence over matters relating to the casinos, racing, gambling, and wagering, and to provide for the continued regulation of those matters. Now, in terms of the legislative framework in the gambling industry, the gambling industry is an area of concurrent legislative competence, as casinos, your racing, and gambling and wagering are listed in Part A of Schedule 4 of the Constitution. And our Section 146 specifically provides that determines which legislation will prevail in the event of a conflict between national and provincial legislation on a Schedule 4 matter. Our presentation today is derived from three key aspects, that is the legal imperatives, the gaming control perspective, as well as the research perspective. We'll start with the legal imperatives. The bill in its current form introduces a casino operator fee. However, we went back to the Western Cape Gambling Act, as well as the current bill. It does not define an operator fee. In this regard, the gambling industry is a very technical industry. As a result, we propose that the bill defines what an operator fee is. Secondly, we understand that the intention of the bill is to amend the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Act so as to provide that certain fees are to be paid to the board instead of the Provincial Revenue Fund. In this regard, in cases where a PLA may have a direct financial interest in granting and the renewal of licenses, the ability to decline and place restrictions and cancel licenses due to non-compliance may be eroded. In no way are we suggesting that this will be the position that the board will take. However, it is a risk that the Western Cape Gambling Board must take into account. We'll touch on the proposed LPM operator fee. We've seen the increase in the operator fees, and as the NGB, we propose that the deletion of the 10-year exclusivity period may entrench the existence of monopolies and create high barriers to entry. I will touch on this point again later in my presentation. From a gambling control perspective, we went through the bill and we found that it is not clear if the proposed LPM operator fees apply per site operator or per route operator. We also seek further clarity on whether the proposed LPM operator fees are applicable to allocated or installed LPMs. In the Western Cape, this is the current position. We have two route operators, that is Grand Gaming and Vukani Gaming. The allocated LPMs, it's 1,500. The installed LPMs for Grand Gaming is 1,068. And the active LPMs, it's 812. And the active sites, it's 212 and 224, sorry. For Vukani Gaming, it's also allocated, it's 1,500. The installed LPMs, it's 834. The active LPMs, it's 753. And we have active sites of 159. Should we get the clarity in where does the LPM operator fees apply, we will be in a position to make further assessment in the application of the LPM operator fee that is proposed by the bill. However, this is the current position in the Western Cape. Secondly, we also seek another point of clarity in that the LPM operator fees must be market related and affordable to the gambling industry. Therefore, at this point, it is not known whether an analysis regarding the feasibility of the increased LPM operator fee is payable by the existing market. That such a study has been conducted for the existing market. We also seek clarity in this regard. Coming to our research perspective, the proposed LPM operator fee calls into question the issue of transformation in the gambling industry. As a new player in the gambling industry, the considerations you take into account is the cost of licensing. Will you be able to afford the license condition as well as the levies that are taxed as a result of you being a player in the gambling industry? Therefore, one would say the LPM operator fees have a bearing on the ability of new entrants to participate in the LPM industry. They present high barriers for entry, and this deters new entrants in the industry, thereby consequently entrenching the existence of monopolies in the gambling industry, and this could possibly stifle competition. The LPM operator fees further deters from the government's agenda, which is transformation, because this could lead to fewer HDIs being able to participate in the gambling industry, specifically in the Western Cape. In my table on my right, we have the GGR in the Western Cape for the financial year 2017-2018, 2018-2019, and 2019 to 2020. In 2017-2018, the GGR is at 768,735,046. There was an increase in the financial year 2018-2019. We also saw an increase in the 2019-2020 financial year. Collectively, the compound interest in GGR in the LPM sector in the Western Cape is on an average of 11%. Therefore, one would want to find out the rationale for the increase in the fees of the LPM operator fees from a minimum of 50,000 per annum to a minimum of 1.9 per annum, which then translates to an almost 4,000% increment. Taking into account the implications of the bill, as the NGB, we urge the Western Cape to conduct an affordability assessment to ensure that the proposed LPM operator fees is affordable to the existing market, because the current LPM operator fees deters from the government's transformation agenda and may impede the new entrants, specifically HDIs, to enter the gambling industry and actually participate. These fees result in high barriers to entry and may prevent equal opportunity for a market player to participate in the gambling industry. Most importantly, this will not be in line with the Competition Act, which requires an equal opportunity to participate in the national economy of South Africa. In conclusion, Honorable Chairperson, it is important that the PLAs continue to balance the socio-economic impact of gambling against any revenue generation for the benefit of all South Africans. I thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Matu. Okay, it's 10:51. You finished 1 minute early. Professor Collins, are you with us online at the moment? I know you got cut off a little bit earlier.
I think you've sorted it out for me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Professor Collins. Are you able to flight your presentation, or would you like
I can't flight it myself. You can flight it if you want to, but I don't particularly need to flight it.
Okay. I'm going to then ask. Thank you, Ms.
Right. Can you still hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Collins.
Oh, you can, right. Well, let me say, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion. I'd preface my remarks by saying that although this looks like a small issue, it's not just in gambling that small issues raise very big ones. And it's not just in South Africa that provincial issues raise national ones and indeed global ones. I have quite a short presentation. It contains 3 observations of general principles and 3 observations about particular practices. In the case of South Africa, one of the big issues which this small amendment raises is the whole question of funding the regulation of gambling. And it actually happens that through nobody's fault particularly, South Africa does have the most expensively regulated gambling industry in the world by quite some way, largely because it has 9 provincial boards and 2 national boards. But leaving that question aside, the distribution of income between the boards is very uneven, and the rational thing to do would be to fund the regulation of gambling by license fees and to pool those license fees and to distribute the money to provinces on a pro rata basis, rather than having separate funding strategies for each province and for the national board, which has the result, for example, that there is huge inequity between the budget of Gauteng and the budget of the Western Cape. So that is something I would urge you to think about in this connection. Relatedly, exclusivity, as I understand it, has actually nothing to do with this issue. Exclusivity is what is the protection from competition which the Western Cape government sold by competitive tender, and which Sun International won largely as a result of offering to contribute financially as well as managing the construction of the convention center, which has been a huge benefit to the Western Cape and has provided employment. However, whatever one thinks about the issue of exclusivity, the fact is that exclusivity is a thing. So the first question is the funding of gambling. The second issue is really about to keeping crime out, to ensuring fairness to players, and very, very importantly, to protecting the vulnerable. That's not just children, but it's people who are, for whatever reason, liable to incur unaffordable losses by gambling, with very often devastating consequences for their families. And that actually is the issue which most exercises the public and the voters. They worry about gambling because they worry about problem gambling. So it's very important that in thinking about how to fund the regulation of gambling, you also think about what the regulation of gambling is supposed to achieve. And the third point, general point I would make, is simply that all regulation, but particularly the regulation of gambling, is a matter of balance, striking a balance for which there's no single right answer between consumer and citizens' choices and consumer protection and the furtherance of the public interest, which of course includes whatever you can use taxation for. The more tax you spend on regulation, the less you've got to spend on education and healthcare and so on. So those are the three general points that I would make. Preferably keep gambling, the regulation of gambling cheap. Preferably keep it focused, particularly on problem gambling. And secondly, balance it between consumer choice and the public interest. As to the next general thing, I would say, here's the next slide. Can we have the next slide? It's called COVID, yes. I mean, COVID has just simply changed everything. I mean, it's clear to me that these regulations, these amendments were drawn up at a time when gambling companies and other leisure businesses could reasonably be expected to at least perform as well as they had previously, if not better. And that, frankly, is no longer the case and won't be for a long time. We'll feel it most next year. So everybody is going to have to cut their coat according to their cloth. We are in for a time of recession, which means everyone needs to economize. However, lockdown may be a medium-term opportunity, even if it's a short-term calamity. It's an opportunity to fix things that need to be fixed, and not just in the gambling thing. And moreover, we're not alone in this. And so it's not all bad news. There are many things which we can do better, ranging from the way we work to the way we teach, as well as the way we regulate gambling. And these issues would have had to be addressed anyway. So, as I say, short term, it seems to me COVID is a calamity, but it might be used as a way of causing us to realize many things, and address many problems that we had been hitherto sweeping under the carpet. Next slide, please. No, it's not keys, functionalities. I think.
Zaira?
Chair, I believe Professor Collins is on mute.
Sorry, everybody, the chair just, she's logging back in, but she'll be here shortly.
Colleagues, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can, Chair.
Okay. Apologies about that. I'm now on my phone's data.
Chair, I think your connection must still find some stability. I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Hi,
Can you
Professor.
hear
We
me?
can hear you well, but
You can hear me now, can you?
yes, but the chair has just been cut off. We're just waiting for the chair to come back on.
Well, I'm sorry about that. I'm not quite sure where you lost me. I mean, the key dysfunctionalities, which is the slide that's up, that I've identified, are there's something clearly wrong if Gauteng spends over $1 billion on regulating gambling. The Western Cape has 60 million. It seems to me there's seriously inadequate delivery of prevention and treatment measures to help problem gambling and their families and others affected by excessive and compulsive gambling. There's inadequate knowledge. We don't have any data since about 2010 of participation and problem gambling rates amongst gamblers, at both legal and illegal venues, of which there are quite a lot in the Western Cape. And of course, we have, as I was saying, unregulated gambling on the internet through this legal loophole. And my final two proposals, therefore, really relate to encouraging the Western Cape to ensure that however the board is funded, it takes responsibility for carrying out research and ensuring that adequate prevention and treatment facilities are in place, because I'm afraid they're not currently. They may become so again, but they are not currently available as they used to be through the SARGF, for which I was an employee. And as I say, not only should measures be put in place to prevent problem gambling occurring in the first place, warning people about the dangers of gambling and how to avoid it, but also offering treatment and help for gamblers and their families whose gambling gets out of control. And in addition to that, you need measures in place to assess the effectiveness of what you're doing. You know, you spend this money on regulation. How effective is the regulation in reducing gambling-related harms, or indeed in generating public benefits through taxation? And my final proposals relate to the internet. The first thing says, can we have the last slide? Can we have a slide saying proposal the internet? Well, I've done that slide. That's right. Thank you. And the first thing, as I say, you must face it. As far as exclusivities payments are concerned, the horse bolted. Frankly, the Western Cape government should have gone to Sun International and Soho and said, what will you give us in 2010, which is analogous to the convention center, if we let you do what you want to do? In Soho's case, to move their casino, and in Sun's case, not to have them move their casino. But either way, it should have been decided on the basis of the public interest. But that horse has bolted. There is no longer any exclusivity for the province to sell. And you also got to face the fact that it's actually impossible, however determined people say they are, it's impossible to actually prohibit gambling on the internet effectively. I mean, it's even worse than trying to prohibit drugs, or for the matter of that, alcohol, to say nothing of cigarettes in recent times. However, you can use incentives. In other words, you can use carrots rather than sticks, mainly by saying that if you want to advertise internet gambling, you have to be a company that's regulated and taxed in this country. And because companies that are licensed in this country will also have facilities to which players can complain if they think they're being cheated, or which can develop software which enables them to detect when people's gambling is going out of control, and regulators can insist that they use such software, as well as player identification and so forth. Customers will actually prefer gambling on the internet with a company located here than with a company located abroad. So my advice is, don't fight all this betting on roulette, which we see endlessly advertised on the television, but seek to turn it to the advantage of South African companies. Thank you very much, and I apologize that I had no control over all the technical hitches, but thank you very much for all your help.
Thank you, Professor Collins. And from my side as well, I've also been having some technical problems, and I know 2 other members also seem to have had a few technical problems. So we are all in the same boat today, unfortunately. But to everyone, thank you so much for your presentations. Those are all of the stakeholders who have presented now, who have indicated that they would like to make oral presentations. Colleagues, we are going to take a break now. I'm going to allow us to come back at 10:55. That's 15 minutes in order for stakeholders, colleagues, members, officials to just have a comfort break, perhaps make another cup of coffee. And then after that, we will find out whether there are other stakeholders in the meeting who would like to make a comment, who have not indicated previously that they would like to make an oral presentation. We will also then have questions and answers, and I will give preference to the stakeholders, because members will also have a 3-hour session on Friday in order to ask extra questions. But I'm sure that we will have lots of time later. So at 10:55, we will resume the meeting. Thank you so much. committee meeting. Firstly, I would like to find out whether there are any persons of the public who are in the meeting today and who have not presented who would wish to make an input at this moment. Is there anyone in the meeting from the public who would wish to make an input at this moment on the bill who has not done so previously in written or oral form? Okay. It does not seem as if there are any other members of the public in our meeting today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to allow for questions and answers on the presentations. And I see a hand, Mr. Altini.
Hi, it's Leona Engelbrecht here, Ms. Altini's colleague. Just on an administrative note, I understand there was some issue with our audio. It might not have been heard clearly by everybody in the hearing. And we just want to make an offer to submit our speaking notes that were presented, and would similarly ask that the other presenters, if they have speaking notes that can be submitted, submit those, as we also had some audio issues with the first two presentations and the professor's presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Engelbrecht. That is in order. You are welcome to submit your speaking notes. And if any of the other presenters wish to submit their speaking notes, that would also be in order. We have also, as members of the committee, received what we term a matrix of all of the written submissions as well, from all the different stakeholders as well. So members have that in front of them or on their email. Are there any hands at the moment in terms of questions and answers for any of the presenters that have presented today? I will take the first three hands. Going once, going twice. Okay, I do not see any hands. Mr. Phillips, welcome. I see you just entered into the meeting. I hear a person's name, but I don't. Oh, yeah, there we go. Mr. Phillips.
Chairperson, I probably missed out the first part of your introduction.
No problem. What I did was I welcomed everyone back into the meeting after the comfort break. I then asked if there were any other members of the public who are in the meeting who would like to make an input and who have not done so through the written or the oral means so far yet. And there were no extra persons from the public. I then asked for hands, the first three hands. I saw none. So now I wish to ask you, Mr. Phillips, if you could perhaps respond to some of these submissions.
Sorry, Chair.
Hi.
I'm following on my phone and I don't see. Oh, I think I see the hand function now.
Okay.
Is Honourable van der Westhuizen, may I proceed with some questions?
No problem, Honourable van der Westhuizen. You may proceed.
Thank you. Chair, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody that presented. I would just like to ask of particularly Professor Collins, the whole principle of industry regulating itself or being responsible for the cost of regulating itself. And as we've seen in the case of Gauteng, the costs and the income is in balance with one another. Whether that principle is something which he believes is something that one can strive for and that it's a correct principle. And then secondly, if I could ask of Advocate Pillay and others representing the industry, what are your proposals to increase the revenue? Have you done some calculations, and would it be possible for the Western Cape to increase its revenue? Because if we're going to transfer all revenue straight to the board, obviously at this point in time, the board will not be able to operate. It will be at a severe loss, and it will still be necessary to subsidize the board. I mean, transferring the funds is not going to solve the problem in itself. So the question is just now, how do you believe should the Western Cape be increasing its revenue from gambling? Or because it seems to me, Chair, as in comparison with the other provinces, if it's not as if the Western Cape's Gambling Board is too expensive, or that its cost structure is way out too high for the turnover that we have in the province. Thank you. And I do know, I've noted the input of saying, let's say 0.5% of the gambling revenue, but is that an easily measurable and auditable figure? And how much would 0.5% render in terms of the Western Cape's gambling activities? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to then allow for Professor Collins to deal with the question directed to him, and then Advocate Pillay for the question directed to her. And please indicate if you'll be answering for both stakeholders, both clients, or only for one of the two in terms of those proposals. And then afterwards, I will then allow for Mr. Phillips. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think the first point to make is that you must ask the questions the other way round. You don't ask first, how do we fund the boards? You ask first, what does it cost to get the boards to do the things we want them to do, to enable the boards to do the things we want them to do? As I say, those are usually keeping crime out, particularly money laundering, ensuring fairness to players, and very importantly, protecting the vulnerable and reducing gambling-related harms. And you then think, what activities are we going to engage in order to achieve those objectives? For example, we'll have a helpline, or we'll have a team of counsellors available, or we'll have funds for inpatient treatment, or we'll have a schools program, or we'll have a public awareness campaign, or whatever it may be. And what's more, we'll do research so that we actually know how big the problem is, and where it is, and what kind of problem it is. So you first of all set out the activities that you want your board to supervise and commission, and you then cost those in terms of normal market forces, what it would cost to hire people to do these various things. And having worked out what the total money you need is, you then work out what that is as a percentage of gross gambling revenues. And you then charge the various industries on a proportion of their gross gambling revenues to pay for that. And people don't mind that because they know what they're paying for. They're not just it's not just some arbitrary thumbsuck of, say, 5% or 1% or 0.5% or whatever it is, or 0.1% as it was in the case of the SARGF. So industry is happy with that, and regulators should be confident that they've got enough money to carry out the activities which they deem necessary in order to minimize gambling-related harms. Having said that, it's complicated in South Africa because you have 9 provincial authorities, a national lottery board, a national gambling board, and in addition to that, you don't simply charge people 0.1% to fund the SARGF. You also charge them, their main cost is licensing fees. And that's the main source of revenues for the provinces, one way or the other, from the industry. And the trouble with that is that originally, you had to have a license in every province. You had to go through prove that you were a fit and proper person, and so on. Well, very sensibly, people decided that, if you were a fit and proper person in the Free State, the chances are you're a fit and proper person in KwaZulu-Natal. So rather than simply waste all that money duplicating the same investigations 9 times, it was decided that if you're licensed in one province, then that license is good for all the others. And the result of that, of course, has been that with casinos, all the license money goes to Gauteng, because most of the casinos are headquartered there. And so Gauteng has this enormous budget and a huge number of employees. I mean, I think it's got at least 100, I think. And they don't, frankly, do that much more than any other board does. So, I mean, my thinking on this is that really the provincial, the provincial coordinating bodies should get together and agree that license money actually should be distributed between provinces on some equitable basis, rather than having this quite proportionate amount of license fee going to Gauteng, with the result that the other provinces, including the Western Cape, have to struggle with either gouging extra money out of the industry or taking money out of the provincial budgets. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I hope it does.
Thank you, Professor Collins. Advocate Pillay, are you with us still?
Chairperson, if I may, it's Esty Brand speaking from Edward Nathan Sonnenberg.
No problem.
Advocate Pillay unfortunately had to drop off on the call, but I am available to answer questions on behalf of Tokosan and Vukani Gaming.
No problem, you may go ahead.
If I may address the question by the Honourable Van der Westhuizen, he had asked whether the industry can make proposals as to assist with the revenue raising efforts. The question, I understand, was not directed at Toho and Vukani, who had already made proposals in its submissions, which were repeated by Advocate Pillay, but rather I understand he dug deeper on those proposals, which I would like to answer. The question that was asked was whether we are able to quantify the amount of the 0.5% GGR that was proposed by Tokosan. The short answer is that we aren't able to quantify that because we can only speak, Toho can only speak to 3 of the casinos, and while the other 2 casinos in the Western Cape is owned by Sun, and we don't have access to each other's GGR, obviously for obvious reasons. But it is a quantifiable figure because the GGR, the gross gaming revenue, is reported on by the licensees to the board. So the board has those figures, and they should be able to quantify what the proposal is. If the question is, if you can calculate what the proposal is, is it sufficient for the purposes of the province, of the revenue raising efforts? Our response to that is we cannot say whether or not it's sufficient, but if it is not sufficient, our stance is that it should be looked to the other industry players, the online gamblers and the other licensees to fill that gap and to come to the table to support the efforts of revenue raising and not just to the 2 licensees in question. Those are our submissions.
Thank you, Ms. Brandt. And given that the proposal of 0.5% of gross gaming revenue will affect the other 2 casinos, I want to find out if Sun International has a view on that proposal from Tokosan and Vukani's representatives. Ms. Engelbrecht or Mr. Altini, are you with us?
Thank you, Chair. I'm with you. Insofar as the 0.5% proposal is concerned, we don't have a view that we can express in this hearing. It's something we're happy to consider and make a further submission on. We weren't aware of it before now. Insofar as whether or not we've done any calculations and made any proposals, the short response is, with respect, no, we haven't, because our starting point is the same as Professor Collins, which is that one must first undertake the exercise of assessing what the regulatory function of the board is and should be, and what its composition is and should be, and determining what the cost is that's associated with that, and then coming up with a means to fund it, if that needs to be any different from existing license fees at all, which, as well as additional ad hoc investigation costs, which are paid in and can be budgeted for. If there's still going to be a shortfall, and there is a real justification for that shortfall, well, then a proposal can be made in terms of perhaps increasing license fees by small amounts or whatever it may be, rather than imposing additional costs and taxes which haven't existed before now.
And it's Leona Engelbrecht, maybe to add to what my colleague has said. In this instance, the fees are calculated with reference to historic fees, the exclusivity with reference to the proposed casino operator fee, and the previous LPM operator fee, which, as the government submitted, was adjusted to reflect what the cost would be at current level, and that falls short of an actual cost assessment and a reasonableness assessment to determine how it relates to the actual regulation and the funding of the board.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips from the department. I'm going to allow you to now respond to any or all of the submissions, depending on the content. You have the floor.
Thanks, Chairperson. I think when we started off the presentation, we highlighted actually that from a provincial government perspective, actually, it have many players actually that needs to be funded. It centers around a decision on the priorities of government, its programs, and then obviously on the hard choices that need to be made with regard to either providing a good education, health, roads in the province, etc., vis-a-vis basically having to pay for the regulation of specific industries. And I think that's probably the one argument. The issue around gambling and LPMs, actually, it was given as a right, almost in terms of the right to trade in a specific geographic space. Also, at the same time, actually, also with regard to the rollout of the LPMs in the province, and all of them actually links to looking at actually the ownership structure also within the province. So in other words, when we speak about casinos and we speak about LPMs, even though we are speaking of two different forms of gambling, actually they are somehow actually also co-owned actually by the respective players in here. So from a provincial perspective, actually, when we draw a comparison, actually, and I've tried actually do with one of the slides just to show the efficiencies across the number of gambling boards across the provinces. Irrespective of the size, there are certain statutory functions that are performed actually by these boards actually that to make sure that the right of the patrons, the right of the industry and everything is actually protected basically as well. So certain statutory functions basically becomes transversal across, irrespective of how small it is. If you consider just the size of the board and what we are speaking about, actually, we are saying on average actually it costs almost 70 million per annum to actually to operate the Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board, as opposed to the licenses actually that's been issued in this province. Actually, there's only 5 licenses being issued actually for operating casinos, and based on the bidding process actually that happened in prior years actually, and the exclusivity actually it was assigned to players actually, which in the main actually is only 2 players actually in the province actually, which is Tsogo and Sun International. In that regard, so it's actually almost on that basis. I think when we did the slides, we also said, look, if one actually need to draw a provincial comparison in terms of the cost of performing or at least conducting the industry within the Western Cape, one would actually also have to consider basically the geographic landscape of the province. At the same time, the size of the industry and the number of players and the right to trade in a specific geographic space or an area actually that's of consideration actually in this regard. There were quite a few other questions with regard to who pays and why not the others, and I will probably hand over to my colleague Claire Horton just to jump in on that one as well. And I think, Chairperson, maybe with regard to a response, we've actually put out a lengthy, I think over 100-page response actually to all of the questions asked by the respective players within the field. Can I just, Claire, if you just want to jump into who pays and why, whatever?
Okay. Good morning. In terms of the proposal, we are looking at the casino and the LPM sectors at this stage, as these two components of the gambling sector are by far the largest components, accounting for more than 85% of the revenue for the province. Moreover, the regulatory compliance is skewed heavily towards casinos and LPMs, given their relative size to the bookmakers and the totalized data. The inclusion of the bookmaker licenses could still be considered and has not been ruled out at this stage. But the factors that would need to be considered are vastly different, given that the bookmaker is, in most cases, an independent operator, as opposed to a listed company. So the complexities are a bit different, but it's not been ruled out at this stage. Similarly, in terms of the totalized data, currently the province is responsible for making a transfer payment to Kenilworth Racing in terms of supporting the hosting of horse races. So the industry is vastly different in terms of the two LPM and the casinos. In terms of the question being posed, what would be the 0.5% additional tax imply in terms of revenue? We did provide as part of our answers to the matrix, if assuming that the 0.5% proposal would be applied to the casino industry as a whole, and not merely the tsogo component of the casino industry. We estimate that to be approximately 14 million rand additional revenue that would be derived from this. However, I think one must have some cautions to that, in that the board's cost structure are fixed, whereas this would be a bit more of a volatile source of revenue. And there are also current efforts by the gambling operators to minimize their tax liabilities in terms of the free play matter that is currently before the courts and is under appeal at the moment, at present. Thank you.
Chairperson, just on the issue on the independent board that we are speaking about and the industry funding it, I think from a provincial perspective and a governance perspective, actually the board actually there is actually the checks and balances actually to ensure that the board remains independent through the appointment processes on the one hand, through its reports on a quarterly basis to the provincial legislature and to the minister of finance, as well as actually our interactions actually on a regular basis actually with the board on a monthly basis. So from a check and balance with regard to the independence of the board, I think that's actually also been one of the key elements actually of the legislation, as well as the internal processes actually to provide for checks and balances actually with regard to the independence of the board. And I think just maybe the last one actually with regard to the two route operators actually for the LPMs. The Western Cape Gambling Board has approved the rollout of 3,000 LPMs across the province. Within that particular scope, actually, as mentioned by the National Gambling Board as well, 1,500 and 1,500 has been awarded to the two route operators for the rollout across the province. Actually, and that actually also in that case actually it also provides some element actually for the rollout across, even in areas where empowerment or barriers to entry actually needs to be reduced for the rollout of those machines. Thanks, Chairperson, for the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to allow for another round of questions. If there are any of the stakeholders with us today or members who would like to ask a question, this is your moment to shine. Going once. Going twice. Okay, I see no hands from members or from stakeholders. That will then bring us to the end of today's public hearing, as there was no indication also that there are other members of the public in the meeting other than the current stakeholders. Colleagues, thank you so much. I'm going to now allow for the stakeholders as well as the department to leave the meeting. You're welcome to stay, obviously, because it is a public meeting. And then members will continue to resolutions if there are any. But thank you so much for your participation today. What will now occur in the process is on Friday at 1 o'clock, the committee will be sitting again, and that will be regarding the deliberations on all the written and oral submissions that we have received. And then in October, on the 7th of October, there is to be confirmed at the moment, but it will be the informal and formal considerations on the content of the bill. But all of the information is also on the Western Cape Provincial Parliament's website. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairperson.
No problem.
Thank you,
I'll allow
Chairperson.
those who wish to leave now. No problem. Thank you so much for being with us today. Okay. Members, are there any resolutions from today? Please note that we will be continuing with deliberations on Friday from 1 o'clock until 4 o'clock in terms of the written and oral submissions received. Going once, going twice. If there are none, colleagues, thank you so much for today's meeting. We will then see you on Friday at 1 o'clock. The meeting is thus adjourned.